Welcome to today's webinar. The topics are around banking and finance and the cannabis industry around the world, but today we're going to have a heavy focus on North America and the United States in particular. This webinar is brought to you by the Cannabis Means Business Conference, formerly known as CWCBE, but re-emerging with this focus on driving deals and helping expand the cannabis industry in the Northeast, across the country, and around the world. Today's topic is at the heart of a lot of what is driving both success and challenges in cannabis, understanding the banking dynamic, financial management, and how businesses can navigate all of those challenges is sort of top of mind, I think, for all of us. My name is Chris Day. I am the co-founder of the Global Cannabis Network Collective and want to send my appreciation to the Cannabis Means Business Conference team for inviting me to moderate this excellent panel today of experts on this topic. Peter, Cassidy, Jennifer, thanks so much for joining us. As we roll in, I'd love for you all to do some self-introductions. You'll do it better than I, and then we can roll into the meat of the topic. But while you're introducing yourselves, I'd also like you to give us a quick nugget on what topic or issue you see as you're talking to cannabis industry businesses, whether plant touching or adjacent. Like, what is the top topic that you're hearing about, consulting people on, and really interacting with people on in banking and finance? So Jennifer, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Cassidy and close out with Peter. Great suspenders there today, Peter. I love it. Way to differentiate. Jennifer, why don't we get started with you?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chris, both to your organization and Cannabis Means Business for having this panel and inviting me to participate. So thank you so much. Again, my name is Jennifer Makris. I come to the industry in a professional capacity by way of cannabis cash consulting. So working with financial institutions and cash in transit couriers and the on-site management and visibility of cash. I have the privilege of being the Director of Banking and Finance for Cannabiz Media, working with financial institutions and ancillary companies on the rapid verification of licenses, as well as a lead generating platform to access license holders across the country and in all legalized nations. To your question, Chris, one of the things that I think I see most of is going back to the core offering of visibility of cash. So cash in the physical movement of cash, working with retail operators, but specifically or in addition to that, is working with those financial institutions, insurance providers on a verification and authenticity of licensed holders. So right, the good versus the bad actors in this space. So that's kind of what I've been seeing, especially over these last couple of years. And the banking availability in the industry has really, and I'm sure Peter will speak to this, but is really much more available than it was 18 to 24 months ago. So really excited about that as well. So again, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Jennifer. How about you, Cassidy?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for having us on today. My name is Cassidy McFarland. I'm one of the franchisees for Dope CFO Certified Advisors. We work with operators in the space, providing accounting, tax, and CFO services. Before that, I spent about 15 years in the banking community. And I would say, probably to your question, the biggest thing that arises with us is compliance, making sure everything is dialed in, not only for reporting to the financial institutions, but maybe other outside investors or outside lending, private lenders that want to make sure that we're up to par and compliant to sell the products that we produce.
Perfect, thanks. Yeah, compliance and banking and finance seem to go hand in hand, regardless of which market or country I'm talking to folks in. So one of the questions I want to touch on in a little bit is around how the heck we keep up with all the never-ending changes. But before we jump into that, Peter, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Chris. My name is Peter Su. I'm the Director of Specialty Banking for Hanover Bank, meaning I run our cannabis banking program. This is actually my third time as team lead for a cannabis banking program, and I've been a consultant with dozens of programs around the country. I guess what I hear a lot of these days, and kind of following up on Jennifer's point, banking access, meaning, literally having an account, that's evolved a lot over the years. In my early days, like that would be the number one question: how do I get an account? What's the process, etc. These days, I'm going to say this idea that cannabis banking isn't available is a myth. To be honest, I see the opposite happening. Most situations that I get into in a prospecting situation, I'm in a competitive situation, meaning I'm being shopped. And I'm actually getting to the point where there's, pushback, right? They don't want this, they don't want that, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, what is top of mind these days is really financing. So is capital available? Is bank financing available? And at what rates? In other words, is bank rate available to cannabis? And I assume we'll cover that more later on. But the short answer is yes.
Thanks, Peter, and each of you for the introductions. Actually, it's the perfect segue, Peter, because part of what I want to start with is some of this macro level discussion around what has shifted over the last couple of years. I came into the cannabis industry myself about a decade ago now. And of course, at that point, it didn't matter whether you were plant touching, ancillary, or just use the word cannabis once in a while in a conversation. If you did that and you said it to the wrong person at the bank, you were pretty much shut down and shut out, regardless of relationships. So, at the macro level, I'd like each of you to look a little bit at, what are we seeing trend-wise that is good for cannabis companies in the banking space? Are more services becoming available? But a bigger question, how do we find them? How do we find the banks that are willing to work, are willing to extend more traditional banking services to companies that operate in the space, whether plant touching or not? Because the myth, Peter, that you just said, that banking services are not available is not true, but it doesn't mean it's easy to find, because we also don't see a lot of banks out there, or finance companies, or even private equity in the sense of capital, going out there and advertising that they're in the cannabis space. So I certainly appreciated Jennifer's comment on, like, we have to validate solid operators and the licensing to understand those transactions. But at the heart of all of this is access. So Cassidy, since you sort of work with people on a day-to-day basis in managing finances and all of this, what are you seeing in this space, and how are you advising people on seeking out these types of services?
Definitely. I think overall, we've started to see some of the larger MSOs be able to refinance some of their debt currently on their books, which is definitely a good sign. Gives a little bit of hope that some people are entering the market and seeing this as a growing industry. Working with our operators, building an extensive network of people you can rely on to give you some good referrals. And then also just picking up the phone and dialing and asking questions works just as good. I think if you're in this industry, kind of, always have an uphill battle. And I think these people are used to it, but going out there and getting after it definitely helps.
Yeah, people have forgotten that phones still do exist and work. I think sometimes a voice conversation does indeed help. And certainly the folks on this panel, if you're out there in the audience and looking for people to contact you, nobody's hiding. Everybody's available on LinkedIn and via other platforms to help sort of guide you in these right directions. But Jennifer, I know, at Cannabiz Media, you guys track a lot of this stuff as well. How are you seeing people access resources?
Great question. So I have to just echo what Cassidy said real quick about solutions and availability of consolidating that debt. So there's more and more, you see these MSOs reconfiguring their debt, so or refinancing their debt. So that has definitely come online, and you're seeing more and more articles about that. with that news, right? News, violations, negative news, we at Cannabiz Media have access to that information. So from a resource perspective, whenever there is an article that is sent out or published throughout the industry, we're the first to know about it. So when Trulieve restructured their debt, I believe GTI just restructured their debt a couple months ago. So we have that access, that information available, as well as a lot of M&A activity is occurring, as we know. So we've got various platform dashboards within our platform that has access to that gives information from a right size, right fit, one place, one location for our subscribers. The other thing that Cassidy said is network, right? Picking up that 1,000-pound phone and vetting out a proper partner, whether that's on the FI relationship side, the cash in transit side, the ATM provider side, the merchant services side, really vetting the right partner for you. I give a lot of props and credit to those folks that were willing to take that risk first and enter the market first. So like a Hanover Bank and some of the other financial industries that weren't afraid from a regulatory perspective or a compliance perspective to take that jump and take that leap, whether it started with hemp and now segued into cannabis or vice versa. So partnering with those folks that have been operating in this space for a while versus the ones that are taking maybe the leap now. Those are the ones that you might be their guinea pigs, right? So not to take any credit away from a program that may or may not be fully baked out yet, but working with an FI that has solid processes and procedures in place to make sure that they are a good fit for that cannabis operator.
Yeah, and as a moderator, I have to do my duty of killing off acronyms. So when you say FI, you are saying financial institution, I believe.
Correct.
Okay.
Financial institutions, and obviously the most of us on this line know that a multi-state operator is an MSO. So thank you for correcting me, and I appreciate that. Yes.
No problem. No problem at all. Peter, on the banking side, so Whitney Economics put out this delinquency study middle of last year, and it showed literally billions of dollars in late accounts payable floating through the market, which has this enormous trickle down effect into the whole industry. MSOs alone accounted for over $1 billion of that, and yet they're also now sort of in the lead of being able to access some of these finances. I get it's big numbers. I get the banks like to deal with big numbers, but if you're a mid-size or a small size operator and you're facing these kinds of needs where, look, a traditional business in a non-cannabis industry might be able to have lines of credit that you can help manage cash flow and get through these types of challenges. Not easy to find. Why is it, and how do we address this notion that MSOs somehow get a pass on access to these types of services, but mid-sized and smaller operators are still having a hard time getting access to them?
That's a good question. And Chris, I just want to point out, because you're the one calling out the acronyms, that behind you is, a bunch of acronyms. But
yes, cannabis means business.
So good news, bad news. And some of this is sort of right now, meaning the current regulatory regime. And the bad news is that some of it, I think, from my perspective, I don't think will change. Okay, so why? Even if you get to the point where a bank is willing and able to lend to cannabis, why won't they do it? Well, there are some very specific challenges. So, your typical cannabis business, your most valuable asset, arguably the license, which you can't put a lien on in most states. Even if you could put a lien on it, what is the value of that license, right? The trade value. So just as an analogy, in New Jersey, I can put a lien on a liquor license. So I lend money to a liquor store. I know almost exactly how much I can turn that liquor license around. It's about 140 grand. Right? So that puts a floor on a lending if I'm going to lend to a liquor store. Such a mechanism does not exist in cannabis. Now, let's say it did, meaning today, right? Loan goes bad. Does a bank, in my case, FDIC insured, publicly traded, do I want now to own a cannabis license? No. So some of that is a right now problem that can certainly change as rescheduling, descheduling happens. So here's something that won't change though, the inventory, right? Again, some of that is right now. Again, why I cannot take those inventory, I cannot value those inventory. But even if I could, what is the value of that license and is value of that inventory, and is it perishable, right? So obviously fresh flower, et cetera, very limited shelf life, right? So what could change? Some of the problems that we have today are like receivables, for example. And I've tried this, by the way. I've called some of the larger receivable insurance companies. So I don't know if you know this, when a bank does a line, a credit facility against a portfolio of receivables, we typically buy insurance on it. Unfortunately, I'm not aware that there is a firm out there that will insure that receivable. And then, of course, and again, this is a right now problem. Do I necessarily want to step into those receivables? And some of that is the optics, federal status, et cetera, et cetera. Again, the good news is that a lot of that can change, but right now that's how it is. More specific to your point, though.
I was gonna just quickly, don't forget what you were gonna say, but I also wanted to quickly interject that I do think there is a lot of hope, because if you look around the world, a lot of countries have bucked this trend, right? There is now at federal levels and continental levels banking services available, say in places like Europe or South America, places that have proactively built these programs. So for those in the US who are like, will this ever change? Is there hope for us? The answer is yes. We obviously have a bunch of stuff still to work through, but I've also seen on the private sector, other institutions sort of developing ways to address some of the issues that you're bringing up, Peter. So anyway, just wanted to throw that out there as a beacon of hope to everybody. And please continue.
So speaking of beacon of hope, right? Like you're seeing these large, very large debt deals happening. If you follow Viridian Capital, for example, they figure almost $1 billion worth of capital flowed into cannabis in 2024, but like 90% of that was debt, and about 75% of that was really earmarked as a refinance. So it's not technically new capital per se. So debt is available. But Chris, to your point, to whom is it available? And of course, here we're creating a little bit of a have and have nots, right? Like if I, big nameless MSO, can borrow at 8%, and Peter Sue LLC has to borrow at 16% LLC. That's a vast difference for every dollar made, from a debt service perspective. Now, why is that? And Chris, you kind of already answered it, which is, well, in theory, right, the amount of risk taking, the jumping off of the cliff, and the amount of work involved in underwriting that $100 million GTI deal is about the same as underwriting that $100,000 loan to the dispensary in town, right? Yes, taking a $100 million swing is a very big swing, but it's also worth it.
Yeah, I'm a champion for mid and small size companies. Always have been. I have a heart for the entrepreneurs. Part of what the Cannabis Means Business Conference is all about is delving into this kind of stuff exactly, right? Like, how is it operating at the macro level, and then how is it also operating at the micro level, and what are the tools that we've got available? I will note for the audience that we've mentioned a couple of places you can stay up to date on information, right? Whitney Economics is always putting out good information. Viridian, they put out regular newsletters that are free to people to look at. They all have paid services too, but good resources for you when you're looking for trends and data. And certainly everybody on this panel also, before we end, can put in additional places for you to shop and look at for information like this. One note, Q&A is open for the audience, so please start putting your questions in there. We've got about 15 more minutes before we shift into official Q&A, but there was one question asked by Mark that I'll bring up now because it's particularly timely, which is, hasn't the recent round of refinancing been effectively trading debt for equity at what he would consider to be onerous terms? But that last piece is opinion. Maybe the others feel differently. But any thoughts on that?
Well, why don't I start if you don't mind? So let's get specific, right? Let's look at the GTI deal. So listen, onerous, to your point, is subjective. The rate, excellent rate, sub 10. I think that the what I might say is onerous is the fact that if that was not a cannabis company, right? So if you were to compare it to, I don't know, Coke, I don't know, I'm meaning Coca-Cola.
Yes, I assumed.
So,
hopefully everybody else assumed that too, but thanks for the clarification.
What was how would you compare it for, let's say, turns against EBITDA, right? That was like less than 1 turn of EBITDA. So for a typical CPG company, I think that that's actually very conservative from a lending perspective. In other words, if GTI was an alcohol company, they could probably easily expect, you know, a much higher ratio. So, and I don't know how much of this is public information, but they traded back a lot of cash for that. In other words, the banks and credit, the FIs, the financial institutions that lent into that accordion, they got back basically dollar for dollar in deposits. So why did they do it? Again, credit facility was worth it from a dollar amount perspective, a rate perspective. And honestly, they actually got back that amount in deposits. Who else can do that today is probably the better question. Can a mom and pop, a solo proprietor, et cetera, can you afford to offer that same term to the bank? If you can, that deal is out there for you.
Yeah, I think it's always, no, not always. It's often a matter of creativity and finding the right people who can understand the economics and have a real conversation, which I will tell folks, like, I'm going to date myself here a little bit, but several decades ago when I first launched my first business, right, all my banking relationships were very personal. Like, I knew exactly who my banker was. I walked in and I talked to them because a lot of the credit extensions or the financing options or the things that I needed to operate my business on a day-to-day basis required them to trust me personally. Now, the numbers had to work also, but that personal relationship was important. And I think that is still true, especially in this industry today. Everybody's like quick to go on, fill out the online application and send the thing in. If you don't have a personal relationship, you're not going to get anywhere. Whether you're a small operator or a large operator, you've got to be willing to make your case and go at it and have that kind of conversation. Cassidy, businesses have a lot to pay attention to when it comes to the cannabis industry supply chain. I don't care where you are along that supply chain. You are working very directly with a lot of different businesses, probably plant touching, many are not. Outside the panic of how the hell do I assess my tax burden and pay it, there's also a lot of questions around how do I keep up with compliance? How do I not get surprised by, some new change or regulation? And how do I stay true on my books to what, all these different entities are looking at me for? How do you help companies manage that? How do we stay up with everything and keep track of everything?
Yeah, for my clients, we actually built out a perpetual data room that organizes all that information and then tie that to a calendar to go back and review those items that need to be reviewed either quarterly or semi-annually, to make sure we're ahead of the game and getting all those items done before they actually need to be done. I would probably say that's probably one of the most successful tactics of just being prepared and ready And then next is managing those cash flows for growth. A lot of operators like to do a lot of things at one time instead of doing the one thing they're really good at over and over. There's a lot of shiny object syndrome that happens, and staying focused on what you're really good at is key.
Yeah, couldn't agree more that the whole notion of, I understand there are some vertically integrated companies have been successful, but traditionally that is not how you would build successful businesses, right? So going back to that report, that delinquency report I mentioned earlier, where we're really asking businesses to operate 12 months of their business on 10 months of actual cash because delinquencies are so high. What tools, what procedures, other than just being hyper vigilant and assuming that you're going to lose like 1 in 6 of your deals, which seems awfully pessimistic, how do we manage to that cash flow equation? Because I really do think on a day-to-day basis, when it really comes down to it, that's what makes people successful or not.
I think in managing that cash flow, I think some people are too soon to extend terms to people that really shouldn't have terms, and proven that they're actually able to pay you and you pay your vendors in a timely manner. There's a lot of trust that needs to happen in business, and contracts are necessary. But a lot of times I think terms are extended way too soon, just to show the sales on the books, even though the cash isn't there, which doesn't help in operating your business at all.
No, and I agree. I've seen this all over the place. I've seen it in hardware, manufacturing equipment, inventory on flour. I think many of us who've been in cannabis for any extensive period of time like to think that it's very much a family of people that are operating in good faith together, but the truth is that while that is somewhat true in a lot of ways, you also have to understand that there's always an uncle or a cousin or a sibling or a child who you probably wouldn't trust to necessarily hit it all the time, and that's true in this family as well. And so we need to be cautious and let people earn their way into terms. I
Chris,
think is good advice.
Chris, you mind if I jump in on this a little bit?
No, not at all.
I have something that's going to sound a little bit like a duh, right? But I think the lack of traditional bank financing is part of the problem here, right? Like under normal circumstances, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't extend terms to all these folks or whatever. You would have perhaps a receivable line, a factoring line, et cetera, right? Any number of these measures. And yeah, to your point, you would essentially underwrite your counterparties, draw on your line of credit from the bank, right? So quite honestly, that is something that can happen today, with all due respect, to some extent, the industry is not doing itself any favors by having these well-known collection issues. Because if imagine someone like me convincing a new bank to get into cannabis, and if I'm saying to myself, what would be great, let's do these like receivable lines, and they, the executive at the bank opens up Google, and they see, what do they see, right? Like endless news stories about the collections issues in cannabis. Again, I realize what I'm saying is a little bit of a duh, but that's the truth.
Yeah, no, we need to take a leading role inside the industry in holding people accountable, and not setting people up for failure, as Cassidy was pointing out as well. Like, if you know that it's unlikely somebody's going to be able to turn that payment around, you shouldn't be sending them the product. Like, a little self-discipline as operators is important. So Jennifer, I want to loop you into this part of the conversation as well. Like, I know you have consulted with a lot of different companies. You work with a lot of different licensees in this space. What are you seeing sort of driving success or challenges? I won't call them failures. Yeah. Success or challenges in the industry, especially around this topic.
And it's always an opportunity, right? Those challenges, we need to convert those into opportunities. And to go back to what Cassidy was saying, listen, long are the days of COD. Don't we kind of miss COD and cash on delivery, Chris? Cash on delivery.
Yes, thank you.
You know, before we're offering terms. So I couldn't agree more. Like, before we are establishing terms, let's establish, you know, fair payment or timely payment upon delivery of goods. One of the tools and resources that we have available, and that is available to the industry, is the Cannabis Credit Association. And they're a newer organization that provides data and reports around AR, collections, debt, not shameless plug, right? But Cannabiz Media recently partnered with Cannabis Credit Association to provide that data, again, in a one-source, one-stop location inside the platform. But anybody can be a member of Cannabis Credit Association and have visibility to the health and the payment health and integrity of the books, essentially, of who they're doing business with. We all want to get paid, right? Some folks aren't doing business with us because they're waiting on their suppliers to pay them, right? So that cash flow and that liquidity is an issue. Again, speaking to the issue with cash receivables and the receivables division of their business. So having visibility to who you're engaging with or who you're getting into bed with is really important. And we haven't had that information available before. So I'm super excited about that partnership, let alone as a standalone organization, what they're providing to the industry, because it's very important information that both we as providers to the industry are needing to see, but also from a financial institution perspective, having that health of who they're engaging with, who they're bringing on board, who they're willing to onboard, can be really part of that compliance and that due diligence process, both from the financial institution, but also who we as suppliers are getting ready to do business with, again, from a vendor management due diligence perspective.
Yeah, thank you. And that, yeah, great resource. Thank you for bringing that up. And I'm just dropping it into the chat for everybody to remember that one as well. One thing that would help a lot, right, is if companies were better capitalized. A lot of times, part of the reason you can't float a 45-day receivable is, even if it is going to get paid, is because you're sort of month to month, week to week on especially mid and smaller size operators. Frankly, many of the MSOs at times are operating that way too. So capital infusions from private equity, investment groups, others ran a pretty good run for a while, and then seem to have dropped off. But I have personally seen in the background some money coming back into the system. Seen a lot more coming into the system in Europe than I have in North America lately, because it's more predictable, more pragmatic at the moment. But what are you guys seeing in terms of access to capital for operators who are, you know, sound leadership teams, decent company, good story, and maybe just need some additional support on, you know, operating capital and such? Are we seeing that come back at all, or is it still on the sidelines?
I'll jump in, Chris, real quick.
Sure.
We've seen capital available for operators that have produced cash flow and are looking for expansion, that have a good management team and a good plan in place. I think capital is no longer as available for those in the startup phase, or when Cannabis back in 2018, you know, someone would write you a check for $2 million without blinking an eye. I think those days are long gone. But I definitely think it's available for the operators that are operating well in the space.
Yeah.
I was going to say almost exactly the. I think you know, if you are if you can show cash flow, you can show a good EBITDA, like those deals are being done. So the reality is what's missing is the speculative lenders and/or investors. Um, and look, it's not without history, right? It's not without justification. The reality is a lot of the early investors got burned. You've got some of these funds looking across the screens, and all they see is red. Would you necessarily keep pumping in money into it? So yeah, I agree with Cassidy that I actually think capital is very available, provided you can show history.
Yeah, and for the audience, I didn't lead the witnesses here at all, but I was hoping that would be the answer because I I have seen the same thing also, and I liken it to industries, starting out as infants and toddlers and then growing up, and eventually you have to join adulthood, and we're in that space now where we're starting to have to do adulting. If you can put forth the right argument, if you can show cash flows, if you can show diligent management within your company, um, people are going to want to support that. It's a good way to do it, but you can't half-ass your approach. You've got to be able to put it together in a professional way, just like every other industry does. And if you do, I have also seen it, you guys. There is capital available. I'm happy to see us, generally speaking, that past that phase where people were just writing checks, because you're right, there were some bad operators early on that not only crushed a lot of market opportunity here in the States, but abroad, where entire continents were shunned for years and are just now starting to come back. But they're coming back with much more solid operations and a lot better opportunity for people who come into it now in a responsible fashion. So we've got about 5 minutes left, folks, for this. So there's a couple of questions in. I'm going to shift to a pure Q&A model here as we close this out, and also ask our panelists for closing comments. But we've got the common question or thread really has been around different methods of cash flow. Cassidy, I think you hit a hot point when you brought that up, right? And topics around like what tools are available, where can I find them? Peter, I'd love for you to talk about, just from a really practical standpoint, if I'm looking for a bank and I want to work, and I think, Jennifer, in our pre-call, you had some answers to this as well. How do I find one? And we all know we can call Peter at Hanover, but if that's not right there, like, where else can I look and what can I do to get this problem solved?
Sure. Yeah. Again, these days, I actually think it's pretty easy to find, right? Like you could literally Google it. But PBC, sorry, I think it is just an acronym. I don't think it used to stand for Payment Banking Compliance, but now they just call it PBC. But they actually do offer a directory. I want to say there's something like 60-ish financial institutions on there, some of which are national. National meaning they cover every legal state. So, yeah, in any given state now, you should not have a problem turning up, at least a handful of options. What I would say is these days, actually, the conversation is progressing, right? So, Chris, to your point, it's maturing, it's evolving. Most of the conversation I have these days are around capability, capacity, and cost. What are you willing to do? How much does it cost? What else is available? It's not like the old days of just, here's a checking account and you can't do, here's a long list of things that we won't offer you. Again, it's being very competitive now. So yeah, again, there is public directories available. In a lot of states now, actually, New York State recently just put out a directory of banks that they, I don't want to say they vetted, because I think they just collected the information. But point is, your state licensing agency probably also maintains a list. And of course, Jennifer.
And to echo what Peter said, more and more states are making that information available, like what they're requiring of financial institutions by state, which I think is really great in terms of a resource and access for those folks that are operating within said state. Minnesota is one, New York is one. So I think it's very interesting, again, kind of how we're evolving and how we're adulting in the industry. So, and when you are engaging with those prospective financial institutions or even cash and transit providers or your merchant processor, for example, transparency above board, I think the most you can reduce your risk to that financial institution or to that partner that you're willing to engage with, the more likely that they're willing to partner with you. And, again, being transparent, having all of your stuff, to Chris's point, proactively, not following the next shiny object. So staying the course really makes you that much more appealing or attractive to those potential partners that you're going to be working with throughout the industry. And, some of the things that I consult on are really providing the touch points through that, ecosystem, financial institutions, cash in transit, cash, and all that. So, and again, the Cannabiz Media platform is a great access to that information and to those resources.
Thank you.
Chris, you mind if I add a little something extra to that? I'm sorry, Jennifer.
Sure, Peter. Why would I stop you?
Jennifer made me think of this. Here's a good point, right? Like the reality is, these days that banks are kind of competing for cannabis businesses now, right? But what we are thinking about is, regardless of how they do it, et cetera, every bank or credit union in the cannabis space today will be doing more than your normal account, quote unquote normal account. So what does that mean? Well, it's going to be a lot of work for us, right? It's a lot of work for me. That means a lot of contact with you. That means we're going to be bugging you with a lot of questions. And so, if you're coming in and you seem prepared, you've got all the paperwork and stuff like that, that makes me think, this guy's got it together. This team knows what they're doing. Conversely, if it takes me a month just to get all the documents from you and then we're talking like basic entity documents, well, then I probably in my mind am thinking, wow, this is going to be a painful relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing also that I'll add here, part of why I built the Global Cannabis Network Collective was to give resources for people that are trying to vet others, right? So we know that we can trust the information from these panelists. They've been in the industry a long time. They've experienced the ups, downs, backs and forths of all of these different topics. And while there are lots of lists out there, it is incumbent on operators, wherever you are along the supply chain, to do your homework too. Like you can't just look up a list and say, oh, well, here's 5 banks, I'm going to call them and then go with the first one. You have to do your due diligence just as much as they have to do due diligence about you. That's what over time creates a good operating relationship between an investor, a bank, a CPA firm, any of these different types of advisory firms. We need each other, but we also need to make sure that we do our homework and assess that the fit is correct. So I would challenge everyone on this webinar, in the audience, the panelists themselves, and of course, I'm calling myself out as much as well, to hold everybody responsible so that we can continue to build the resources and tools that we need to successfully operate these businesses. So Cassidy, I want to start with you on the closing round here, but would love sort of any closing comments, advice you've got for folks as they're assessing finance, capital, banking, that they can take home with them.
I think you hit on this earlier, Chris, but building those relationships that matter, specifically with any of your ancillaries and your financial institution, or if you have a lender. If things go south, don't leave the lender in the dark. Be honest and upfront and give them a solution that they can work with. You'll be surprised of how often they'll be willing to work with you to move things forward. And I would
Great
say
advice.
stay compliant, efficient, and keep those cash flows, try to build up a little space for yourself, for, the unknowns that lie ahead.
Yep. We all have to get to the first 100,000 before we can get to the first 100 million, right? So build it that way. So, Jennifer, closing thoughts.
Yeah, again, thank you again for having this discussion. I think it's very valuable. Cassidy made a point about relationships, and the three of us coming from the financial industry space. It is such a relationship-driven industry, and cannabis is 10x that. So developing those relationships, and those relationships will take you far. Those conversations will take you far. If you're coming up against a wall or a hurdle, those relationships will help navigate through those challenges and those opportunities. And again, we're evolving as an industry. We take 2 steps forward, 3 steps back sometimes, but the availability of resources is expanding. And for me, that is very exciting. So again, thank you for the participants. Thank you, Chris, for moderating. And to my co-panelists, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Jennifer. Peter, you want to close us out with any comments?
Sure. My closing comment is that I refer to these as suspenders.
All right. Well, that there is high value, folks. If you've not ever seen a high value comment, suspenders, and you can find him and his comedy routine at a lot of different trade shows around the country. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Thanks to the Cannabis Means Business Conference for inviting all of us to participate in this discussion. I told the panel before we started, I didn't want to talk about 280E because people hear it ad nauseum. I want to talk about the practical day-to-day business operations and how we can help businesses move forward. And thank you all for doing that. And to the attendees who post questions, you make webinars better by asking them. So thanks for doing that. Do check out the Cannabis Means Business Conference website. Again, it's going to be at the Javits Center the first week of June, and registration is now open. If you have suggestions or needs, wants, desires to be integrated into that conference, it's definitely not too late to send suggestions. For us, it's all about creating an opportunity to help you and the industry build, continue to adult in a responsible fashion and move forward. So thanks everybody. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks all.
Thank y'all.